The rain hammered against the cracked windows of the abandoned warehouse, each drop echoing like bullets in the silence. Sarah Martinez crouched behind a stack of rusted metal barrels, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. 23 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and eyes that had seen too much for her age, she moved with the precision of someone who had learned that hesitation meant death. The warehouse smelled of motor oil and decay, a fitting backdrop for what had become her life. 3 armed men patrolled the space below, their footsteps heavy on the concrete floor. They wore expensive suits that looked out of place in the industrial wasteland, but Sarah knew better than to underestimate well-dressed criminals. Money didn't make them less dangerous. It made them more so. She had been tracking this human trafficking ring for 6 months, following a trail of missing girls that led from the streets of Los Angeles to this forgotten corner of the city. The police had given up after the first month, filing it away as another case of runaways who didn't want to be found. But Sarah knew better. She had been one of those girls once, invisible to a world that pretended to care while looking the other way. The earpiece in her ear crackled to life. "Black Viper, what's your status?" The voice belonged to Marcus Chun, her handler, and one of the few people who knew her real identity. To the rest of the world, she was just another ghost in the shadows, someone who cleaned up the messes that others couldn't or wouldn't touch. 3 targets on the ground floor, she whispered, her voice barely audible. No sign of the girls yet, but there's a staircase leading to a basement level. That's where they'll be. Remember, extraction is the priority. We need those girls alive. Sarah's jaw tightened. She didn't need the reminder. Every mission brought back memories she tried to bury, images of her own captivity that still haunted her dreams. The difference was that she had escaped. Most didn't get that chance. Moving silently along the catwalk 20 feet above the warehouse floor, Sarah studied her targets. The men below were professionals, their movements coordinated, and their weapons held with familiarity. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had grown comfortable. Comfort was the enemy of survival, a lesson Sarah had learned the hard way. She reached into her tactical vest and withdrew a small device no larger than a quarter. The electromagnetic pulse grenade would disable their communications and any electronic security systems they might have. It wouldn't hurt them, but it would level the playing field. Sarah had learned long ago that she couldn't match men in brute strength, but she could outthink them. The device rolled across the floor with barely a whisper of sound, coming to rest behind a support beam. Sarah counted down from 10 in her head, then closed her eyes as the pulse erupted in a brilliant flash of blue light. The warehouse plunged into darkness, emergency lighting flickering and failing as the men below shouted in confusion. Sarah was already moving. She rappelled down from the catwalk with practiced ease, her boots hitting the concrete just as the first man rounded the corner. He never saw her coming. The taser in her hand delivered 50,000 volts, dropping him before he could raise his weapon. She caught his body as it fell, lowering him silently to the ground. 2 more to go. The second man was smarter, or perhaps more paranoid. He had taken cover behind a forklift and was speaking into a radio that no longer worked, his voice growing more agitated with each failed attempt to reach his backup. Sarah could hear the third man moving somewhere to her right, his footsteps deliberately heavy as he tried to flush her out. She smiled grimly. They still didn't understand what they were dealing with. Sarah had earned her codename not through brute force or flashy displays of violence, but through patience and precision. Like the snake she was named after, she struck quickly and efficiently, leaving no trace of her presence except the results of her work. The media had dubbed her the Black Viper after a series of high-profile takedowns that left criminal organizations crippled and their leaders mysteriously disappeared. The authorities knew she existed, but had never come close to identifying her. To them, she was either an urban legend or a very well-organized team of vigilantes. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. She was one woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. moving through the shadows with the grace of a dancer and the purpose of a predator. Sarah flanked the man behind the forklift. He was young, probably not much older than she was, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested this wasn't his usual line of work. That made him unpredictable, but also vulnerable. She was 3 steps away when he spun around, his pistol tracking toward her position. Sarah rolled to the side, feeling the bullet pass close enough to her ear that she could hear its whistle. The man's second shot went wide as Sarah's throwing knife found its mark in his shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the floor. Before he could recover, Sarah was on him. She had learned hand-to-hand combat from some of the best instructors in the world, but her real education had come from the streets and the kind of fights where second place meant death. The man tried to grab her, but Sarah slipped his grasp and delivered a precise strike to his neck that sent him crashing to the ground unconscious. The third man had gone silent, which meant he was either very smart or very scared. Sarah hoped it was the latter. She moved toward the staircase that led to the basement, every sense alert for the slightest sound or movement. The concrete steps were slick with moisture and something else that Sarah tried not to think about. As she descended, the smell hit her. Fear, desperation, and human suffering all mixed together in a cocktail that made her stomach turn. She had smelled it before, in the place where her own nightmare had begun. The memory threatened to overwhelm her, but Sarah pushed it down. There would be time for remembering later. Right now, there were lives to save. The basement was larger than the warehouse above, divided into small cells that had been hastily constructed from chain-link fencing and padlocks. In the dim emergency lighting, Sarah could see movement in several of the cells. Young women, some barely out of their teens, huddled together in the darkness. Their eyes reflected the light like frightened animals, and Sarah felt her heart break a little more. The third man stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, his weapon already trained on the nearest cell. He was older than the others, with gray at his temples and the calm demeanor of someone who had done this many times before. His suit was better tailored, his shoes more expensive. This was the boss, or at least someone high up the food chain. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't place. "The famous Black Viper. You're smaller than I expected." Sarah kept her hands visible, but ready. She could see at least 8 girls in the cells, all watching the confrontation with a mixture of hope and terror. One wrong move, and they would all suffer for it. "Let them go," Sarah said simply. "You can walk away from this." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think this is about money? About some simple criminal enterprise?" He gestured toward the cells with his free hand. "This is about power, about controlling something precious and rare. These girls, they're not just commodities. They're symbols." Sarah had heard all before. Every monster she had faced had their justification, their twisted logic that made them the hero of their own story. She didn't care about his motivations. She cared about the results. "I'm going to count to 3, she said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "Then I'm going to take that gun away from you and use it to unlock those cells. You could decide whether you want to be conscious for that or not." The man's smile faded. "You know, I've heard stories about you. They say you never miss, never fail. But everyone has weaknesses, and I think I know yours." He shifted his aim slightly, pointing the gun directly at a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. "You care too much." Sarah's blood turned to ice. The girl in question was pressed against the far side of her cell, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the weapon pointed at her heart. She had long dark hair and brown eyes that reminded Sarah painfully of someone she had known long ago. "Once," Sarah said. The man's finger tightened on the trigger. "I don't think you understand the situation here." 2. "Stop," the girl in the cell cried out. "Please, I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt anyone else." Sarah's heart clenched at the familiar words. How many times had she said something similar? How many times had she begged and pleaded and promised anything just to make the pain stop? The memory of her own captivity came flooding back. The cold concrete floor, the smell of fear and desperation, the voice of her captor as he explained all the ways he could hurt her. But there was one memory that burned brighter than all the rest. The moment she had decided to stop being a victim. It hadn't been dramatic or cinematic. She had simply looked at her reflection in a piece of broken glass and decided that she would rather die fighting than live in fear. 3. Sarah moved like lightning, diving to the side as the man fired. The bullet sparked off the concrete where she had been standing, but Sarah was already rolling, coming up behind a stack of boxes with her own weapon drawn. The man spun to track her movement, but he was too slow. Sarah's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. He hit the ground hard, but was already trying to get back up when Sarah reached him. She kicked his weapon away and stood over him, her gun pointed at his head. For a moment, the basement was silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and distant sirens. "The keys," Sarah said. The man laughed despite his pain. "You think this ends with me? You think saving these few girls makes any difference at all?" He coughed, and Sarah saw blood on his lips. "There are dozens of operations like this. Hundreds. You're fighting a war you can't win." Sarah knelt down beside him, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Maybe I can't win the war, but I can win today, and tomorrow I'll win again, and the day after that. Eventually, people like you will learn to be afraid of the dark, because that's where I live now." She found the keys in his jacket pocket and began unlocking the cells one by one. The girls emerged slowly, some helping others who were too weak or traumatized to stand on their own. Sarah spoke to them in gentle tones, explaining that they were safe now, that help was coming, that no one would hurt them anymore. But even as she comforted them, Sarah's mind was already moving to the next mission, the next group of girls who needed saving, the next monster who needed to be stopped. The man on the floor had been right about one thing. This was a war, and it was one that might never truly end. As the first police cars arrived and the sound of sirens filled the air, Sarah slipped away through a back exit she had scouted earlier. The girls would be taken care of now, returned to their families, or placed in protective custody. The trafficking ring would be shut down, at least temporarily, and somewhere in the city, another group of criminals would hear the whispered stories about the Black Viper and wonder if they might be next. Sarah disappeared into the night like smoke, leaving behind only questions and the kind of justice that couldn't be found in any courtroom. She had work to do, and the darkness was calling her name. 3 weeks after the warehouse raid, Sarah Martinez sat in a crowded diner on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She wore a blonde wig and colored contacts that turned her brown eyes blue, transformations that made her look like any other young woman traveling cross-country. The art of invisibility had become second nature to her, a skill learned through necessity and refined through practice. The diner buzzed with the usual mix of truck drivers, tourists, and locals, but Sarah's attention was focused on the man in the corner booth. Vincent Kozlov was a mid-level player in the trafficking network she had been dismantling piece by piece, but he was also the key to finding the person at the top of the chain. The man the street called simply the Colonel. Sarah had been tracking Kozlov for 2 days, learning his routines, and waiting for the right moment to make contact. He was careful, but not paranoid, dangerous, but not untouchable. Most importantly, he was desperate. The warehouse raid had cost his organization significant money and resources, and Sarah knew that desperate men made mistakes. She watched as Kozlov finished his meal and left a $20 bill on the table, more than enough to cover a burger and fries. Either he was being generous or he was nervous enough not to wait for change. Sarah guessed the latter. She gave him a 30-second head start, then followed him out into the desert heat. The parking lot was half empty, shimmering with heat waves that made the distant mountains look like mirages. Kozlov walked toward a black SUV parked in the far corner, his hand already reaching for his keys. Sarah had studied his file extensively. 34 years old, born in Moscow, but raised in Chicago after his family immigrated when he was 7. He had a degree in business administration and no official criminal record, which made him perfect for the kind of operation that required a legitimate front. Sarah's footsteps crunched on the gravel as she approached his vehicle. She had timed it perfectly, close enough to the SUV that he couldn't run, far enough from the diner that no one would overhear their conversation. Kozlov spun around as she got within 10 feet, his hand instinctively moving toward his jacket. "I wouldn't," Sarah said, her voice carrying just enough menace to make him freeze. "I'm not here to hurt you, Vincent. I'm here to make you an offer." Kozlov's eyes narrowed as he studied her. He was looking for weapons, for backup, for any sign that this was a trap. Sarah let him look. She appeared to be an unarmed young woman in jeans and a t-shirt, someone who couldn't possibly pose a threat to a man of his experience and connections. That was exactly what she wanted him to think. "I don't know who you are," Kozlov said finally, "but you're making a mistake. Walk away now, and we'll call it even." Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My name is Sarah Martinez. You might know me better by another name, Black Viper." The color drained from Kozlov's face. He had heard the stories, seen the news reports about the warehouse raid, and the dozen other operations that had been shut down in recent months. The Black Viper was becoming a legend in certain circles, whispered about in the kind of places where whispers could get you killed. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Information," Sarah replied. "Specifically, everything you know about your boss, the man they call the Colonel." Kozlov laughed, but it sounded forced. "You think I'd betray him? You think I'd risk everything for some vigilante who'll probably be dead within a month?" Sarah stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the dry heat. "I think you're a smart businessman, Vincent. And smart businessmen know when to cut their losses." She pulled out her phone and showed him a series of photographs, bank accounts, property records, shipping manifests, and communication logs. It was enough evidence to put him away for life, carefully gathered over weeks of surveillance and investigation. "The warehouse you helped organize netted your people, what, maybe $2 million in potential revenue." Sarah continued. "I cost you that. The operation in Houston that got shut down last month, that was me too. The transport convoy that mysteriously disappeared outside Las Vegas, also me. I've cost your organization over $10 million in the last 6 months, and I'm just getting started." Kozlov stared at the phone screen, his face growing paler with each image. Sarah had done her homework, and he knew it. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, the kind of airtight case that prosecutors dreamed about. "What's your point?" he asked. "My point is that your boss is going to start looking for someone to blame," Sarah said. "And when he does, whose name do you think is going to come up? You were in charge of security for 3 of the operations I've hit. Either you're incompetent or you're working with me. Which story do you think he's more likely to believe?" The truth of her words hit Kozlov like a physical blow. Sarah could see it in his eyes, the sudden realization that he was trapped between 2 forces, either of which could destroy him. The Black Viper was hunting him from one side, and his own organization would eliminate him from the other if they suspected betrayal. "Even if I wanted to help you," he said slowly, "the Colonel doesn't trust anyone completely. I've never even met him face to face. Everything goes through intermediaries." Sarah had expected this. Organizations like theirs were built on compartmentalization and paranoia, with each level knowing only what they needed to know. But everyone had weaknesses, and she had been studying the Colonel's operation long enough to identify his. "Tell me about the parties," she said. Kozlov's eyes widened slightly, confirming what Sarah had suspected. The Colonel might be careful about his business operations, but he had one weakness: his ego. According to intelligence reports, he hosted elaborate gatherings at various locations, events where he could display his wealth and power to potential clients and partners. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kozlov said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah showed him another photograph, this one taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed Kozlov entering an upscale hotel in Scottsdale, dressed in formal attire and carrying an invitation. The timestamp showed it was taken just 4 days ago. The Celestial Resort and Spa, Sarah said. Last Friday night. You were there for almost 6 hours. That's a long time for a business meeting, but about right for a party. Who were you there to see, Vincent? Kozlov's shoulders sagged in defeat. He looked around the parking lot one more time, perhaps hoping for rescue that he knew wouldn't come. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. The Colonel hosts these gatherings. Potential investors, high-level clients, people who want to see what they're buying into. It's all very civilized on the surface. Cocktails, dinner, entertainment. But underneath, he shuddered. It's a showcase, a demonstration of the product. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. She had heard about events like this before, gatherings where human beings were treated like merchandise to be evaluated and purchased. The very thought of it made her want to find the Colonel immediately and make him pay for every life he had destroyed. But she forced herself to remain calm. Emotion was the enemy of effective action, a lesson she had learned through bitter experience. She needed information, not revenge. At least not yet. When's the next one? She asked. 2 weeks from now. But you can't just show up. These things are invitation only, and the security. Kozlov shook his head. You'd never make it past the front door. Let me worry about that, Sarah said. What I need from you is an invitation and a layout of the venue. In exchange, I'll make sure that when this all comes down, you're somewhere safe. Kozlov studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. What makes you think I can trust you? Because right now, I'm the only friend you have left, Sarah replied. Your boss is going to figure out eventually that someone on the inside has been feeding information to his enemies. When he does, you can either be the guy who helped catch the Black Viper, or you could be the guy who looks guilty as hell. The logic was inescapable, and they both knew it. Kozlov was trapped in a situation where cooperation was his only chance of survival. After a long moment, he nodded reluctantly. The next party is at a private estate outside Tucson, he said. I can get you an invitation, but you'll need a cover story. These people check out everyone who attends. What kind of cover? Wealthy investor looking to expand into new markets. Someone with money to spend and connections to protect. The Colonel likes dealing with people who have something to lose. Sarah was already formulating a plan. She had connections in the intelligence community who could provide the kind of background documentation that would pass scrutiny. Creating a false identity wasn't difficult when you knew the right people and had the right resources. I'll need a complete guest list, floor plans for the estate, security protocols, and staff schedules, she said. Everything you can get me. Kozlov nodded again, but his expression was troubled. There's something else you should know. The Colonel, he's not just some crime boss looking to make money. This is personal for him. He has a specific type of girl he targets, a specific profile he's looking for. What kind of profile? Young, dark-haired, Hispanic, or Mediterranean features. Girls who remind him of someone specific. Kozlov's voice dropped even lower. There are rumors that he's been searching for one particular girl for years. Someone who escaped from him a long time ago. Someone he wants back. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly around her. The description was too specific to be coincidental, too personal to be random. She thought about her own dark hair, her own features, her own past that she had tried so hard to escape. Could it be possible that the monster she was hunting was the same one who had destroyed her life years ago? What's this girl's name? She asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Kozlov hesitated, then spoke a single word that hit Sarah like a physical blow. Isabella. The name echoed in her mind like a gunshot. Isabella Santos. That had been her name before she became Sarah Martinez, before she learned to disappear and reinvent herself. Isabella Santos had been a scared 17-year-old girl who trusted the wrong person and paid a terrible price for it. Isabella Santos had died in a basement room much like the one she had raided 3 weeks ago, replaced by someone harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. But if the Colonel was still looking for Isabella Santos, it meant that her escape had cost him something significant. It meant that this wasn't just about justice or protecting other girls. This was about finishing something that had started years ago. I'll be in touch, she told Kozlov, then turned and walked away before he could ask any more questions. As she drove away from the diner, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities and implications. The Colonel was hosting a party in 2 weeks, a gathering where he would display his power and his victims to potential investors. It would be heavily guarded and carefully controlled, surrounded by people who would kill to protect their secrets. It would also be the perfect place for Isabella Santos to finally come home. Sarah smiled grimly as she merged onto the highway heading north. She had spent years building the identity of Sarah Martinez, creating a life where she could help others and find some measure of peace. But now it was time to resurrect Isabella Santos one more time, to walk back into the nightmare she had escaped and finish what should have ended long ago. The Black Viper was going to a party, and she planned to make it a night that the Colonel would never forget, assuming he lived long enough to remember it. As the desert landscape flowed past her windows, Sarah began to plan. She would need a new identity, new documentation, and new weapons. Most importantly, she would need to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. The scared girl who had once begged for mercy was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to be merciless herself. The Colonel wanted Isabella Santos back. Sarah was going to make sure he got exactly what he asked for. The Montecito estate sprawled across 40 acres of pristine Arizona desert, a monument to wealth and power disguised as a luxury retreat. Sarah stood at the wrought iron gates, dressed in an elegant black evening gown that cost more than most people made in a month. Her hair had been styled into sophisticated waves, and diamond earrings caught the light from the estate's elaborate security fixtures. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be: Elena Vasquez, a wealthy art dealer from Mexico City with interests in high-end acquisitions. The transformation had taken 2 weeks to perfect. Sarah's contacts in the intelligence community had created a backstory so detailed it could fool a federal investigation. Elena Vasquez owned galleries in 3 countries, traveled in exclusive social circles, and had a reputation for discretion that made her attractive to clients who valued privacy above all else. Most importantly, she had the kind of liquid assets that would make the Colonel very interested in doing business with her. Sarah handed her invitation to the security guard, a mountain of a man whose tuxedo couldn't quite conceal the shoulder holster beneath his jacket. He scanned the elegant card with practiced efficiency, then checked her name against a list on his tablet. The process took 30 seconds, during which Sarah remained perfectly calm despite the fact that her heart was racing. "Welcome to Montecito, Ms. Vasquez," the guard said, stepping aside to allow her through the gates. "Mr. Morrison will escort you to the main house." Morrison turned out to be a younger man with the kind of military bearing that suggested Special Forces training. He led Sarah along a winding path lined with desert flowers and contemporary sculptures, making polite conversation about the weather and the drive from Tucson. Sarah responded appropriately while her trained eye cataloged every security measure she observed. Cameras disguised as landscape features, motion sensors hidden among the cacti, and at least 6 guards positioned at strategic points around the grounds. The main house rose from the desert like something out of an architectural magazine, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Catalina Mountains. Light spilled from every window, and Sarah could hear the sound of classical music and refined conversation drifting across the courtyard. From the outside, it looked like any other gathering of wealthy socialites. Sarah knew better. "Quite a view," she commented as they climbed the steps to the main entrance. "Mr. Reynolds has excellent taste," Morrison replied, referring to the Colonel by what Sarah assumed was one of many aliases. "He believes that beauty and business go hand in hand." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior, decorated with museum-quality art and furnishings that probably cost more than Sarah had spent on equipment in her entire career. The main reception area opened onto a grand salon where perhaps 50 guests mingled with cocktails and canapes, their conversation a subdued murmur of multiple languages and refined accents. Sarah accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and began to circulate, playing the role of Elena Vasquez with practiced ease. She spoke knowledgeably about art and investment opportunities, shared amusing anecdotes about collectors she had supposedly dealt with, and gradually worked her way toward the center of the room, where she could observe the guest list more closely. Most of the attendees were exactly what she had expected: wealthy individuals with questionable morals and flexible ethics, the kind of people who could convince themselves that anything was acceptable as long as the profit margins were high enough. But scattered among them were faces she recognized from intelligence files: arms dealers, drug cartel representatives, and human traffickers from around the world. This wasn't just a party. It was a summit. Ms. Vasquez. Sarah turned to find a distinguished man in his 60s approaching her, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his smile practiced but not quite reaching his eyes. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo and moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "I'm David Reynolds," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to my home." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she shook his hand. After all these years, she was finally face to face with the man who had destroyed her life. He looked older than she remembered, more refined, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't changed, a cold calculation that assessed everyone and everything in terms of their usefulness to him. "The Colonel, Elena Vasquez," she replied, maintaining her cover despite every instinct screaming at her to attack. "Thank you for the invitation. Your home is absolutely stunning. I'm told you're interested in expanding your acquisitions portfolio," he said, studying her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Perhaps we could discuss some opportunities that might interest someone of your refined tastes." Sarah smiled, channeling every ounce of sophistication that Elena Vasquez would possess. "I'm always interested in unique pieces, especially those with interesting provenance." The Colonel's smile widened slightly, and Sarah saw a flicker of something that might have been recognition in his eyes. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. He was beginning to suspect that Elena Vasquez wasn't entirely who she claimed to be. "Excellent," he said. "Why don't you join me for a private viewing? I have some acquisitions that I think you'll find particularly captivating." Sarah nodded, knowing that this was the moment she had been preparing for. Whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. She followed the Colonel away from the main salon, down a corridor lined with priceless paintings, and into an elevator that descended to the basement level of the house. The elevator opened onto a viewing area that looked like something from an upscale auction house, complete with comfortable seating and professional lighting. But Sarah's attention was immediately drawn to the series of one-way windows that lined the far wall. Through the glass, she could see a dozen small rooms, each one containing a young woman who sat on simple furniture with the blank expressions of people who had given up hope. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized what she was looking at. This wasn't just a storage facility or a holding area. It was a showroom. The Colonel was displaying human beings like pieces of art, allowing potential buyers to evaluate their purchases before committing to a transaction. "Magnificent, aren't they?" the Colonel said, his voice carrying the same tone that someone might use to describe a collection of rare books, each one carefully selected for specific qualities: beauty, intelligence, adaptability. It takes considerable skill to identify the right candidates. Sarah forced herself to remain in character, though every fiber of her being wanted to tear the man apart with her bare hands. "They're quite lovely. What kind of arrangements do you typically make?" "That depends on the client's needs," he replied. "Some prefer long-term acquisitions. Others are looking for more temporary arrangements. I pride myself on matching each piece with the right collector." Sarah nodded, as if this were a perfectly normal conversation about perfectly normal merchandise. "And the security arrangements?" "I imagine discretion is paramount in this type of transaction." The Colonel's eyes narrowed slightly. Something in her tone or her questions had triggered his suspicion. "Security is indeed important," he said carefully. "We've had some challenges recently. A competitor who seems determined to disrupt our operations." Competitors can be troublesome, Sarah agreed. I've had similar problems in my own business, though I've found that the best way to deal with them is to understand what they really want. The colonel moved closer, and Sarah could smell his cologne, an expensive scent that couldn't quite mask something darker underneath. And what do you think our competitor wants, Ms. Vasquez? Sarah met his gaze steadily, letting Elena Vasquez's mask slip just enough to reveal something harder beneath. Revenge, perhaps, or justice. Sometimes the two are indistinguishable. The colonel's hand moved toward his jacket, but Sarah was faster. The small pistol she had concealed in her purse was in her hand and pointed at his chest before he could complete the motion. The weapon was ceramic and composite materials, invisible to metal detectors and powerful enough to stop a man at close range. I wouldn't, she said, her voice dropping to the tone that had given her the name Black Viper. We're going to finish this conversation first. The colonel raised his hand slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been admiration. Isabella Santos, he said. I thought you looked familiar. You've grown up quite a bit since we last met. Hearing her real name spoken aloud by this monster was like being struck by lightning. Memories flooded back. The fear, the pain, the desperate hope that someone would save her. But no one had come. She had saved herself, and in doing so had become something that even she sometimes didn't recognize. That girl is dead, Sarah said. You killed her. I'm just here to return the favor. The colonel laughed, and the sound was like ice water in Sarah's veins. Oh, my dear girl, you think this is about revenge? You think killing me will somehow balance the scales? He gestured toward the windows. Look at them. Look at what I've built. Do you really think my death will save any of them? Sarah glanced at the girls in the rooms beyond the glass, each one a reminder of who she had been and who she had saved herself from becoming. They were looking back at her now, sensing that something important was happening even if they couldn't hear the conversation. Maybe not all of them, Sarah admitted, but it will save some, and sometimes it has to be enough. The colonel's expression hardened. You always were too emotional, too idealistic. That's why you'll never win this war. For every operation you shut down, 2 more open. For every girl you save, 5 more taken. You're fighting against human nature itself, and human nature always wins. Sarah stepped closer, the gun steady in her hands despite the rage coursing through her veins. Then, I'll just have to keep fighting, one monster at a time. Even if it costs you everything, even if it destroys whatever chance you might have had at a normal life. The colonel's voice took on an almost paternal tone. You could walk away from this, Isabella. You could disappear, start over somewhere new. Live the life you were meant to have. For a moment, Sarah wavered. The idea was tempting, to put down the gun, walk away from the violence and the darkness, and try to build something resembling a normal existence. She could change her name again, move to some quiet town, and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But then she looked at the girls in the rooms, at their faces filled with the same despair she had once felt, and knew that walking away wasn't an option. She had been given the chance to escape, to become someone who could fight back. With that chance came responsibility. You're right about one thing, Sarah said. This will probably cost me everything. But the difference between us is that I'm okay with that price. The colonel's face twisted with rage and something that might have been fear. You think you're so righteous, so pure. But you're just like me, Isabella. We both take what we want through violence. We both destroy lives to get what we need. Sarah considered this for a moment. There was truth in his words, more than she was comfortable admitting. She had indeed become someone who used violence to achieve her goals, who operated outside the law and made decisions about life and death based on her own judgment. Maybe, she said finally, but there's one important difference between us. What's that? Sarah smiled, and for the first time in years, it was completely genuine. I only destroy the lives of people who deserve it. The shot was barely a whisper, the sound suppressed by the weapon's integrated silencer. The colonel dropped to the floor, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been regret. He tried to speak, but Only blood came out of his mouth. Sarah stood over him for a moment, feeling a complex mix of emotions that she didn't have time to process. Relief, satisfaction, emptiness, and something that might have been grief for the girl she had been before this all started. The colonel was dead, but his death didn't erase the years of pain and fear. It didn't bring back the innocence that had been stolen from her. But it was a start. Sarah moved quickly to the control panel that operated the electronic locks on the holding rooms. The system was sophisticated, but not impenetrable, and she had studied the building's security protocols during her preparation. Within minutes, every door in the facility was open, and the girls were emerging into the viewing area with tentative hope in their eyes. "It's okay," Sarah told them in English and Spanish. "You're safe now. There are people coming who will help you get home." She activated the beacon in her purse, a signal that would bring law enforcement and federal agents to the location within minutes. The evidence of the colonel's operation would be impossible to hide or explain away, ensuring that anyone involved would face justice. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Sarah made her way back to the main floor of the house. The party was still going on, the guests unaware that their host was dead and their business arrangement had just been permanently terminated. Sarah moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, just another wealthy socialite making her exit before the evening wound down. She was almost at the door when Morrison, the colonel's security chief, stepped into her path. His hand was inside his jacket, and his eyes held the kind of suspicion that came from years of protecting dangerous people. "Leaving so early, Ms. Vasquez?" he asked. Sarah smiled politely while calculating distances and angles. "I'm afraid I have an early morning meeting. Please give Mr. Reynolds my compliments on a lovely evening." Morrison's hand tightened on whatever weapon he was carrying. "I think Mr. Reynolds would prefer to say goodbye personally. Why don't you come with me?" Sarah had hoped to avoid any additional violence, but Morrison wasn't giving her a choice. She nodded as if agreeing to his request, then stepped closer as if to follow him. When she was within arm's reach, she moved. The strike was precise and devastating, delivered to the nerve cluster in Morrison's neck with enough force to drop him instantly. He crumpled to the floor unconscious, and Sarah continued toward the exit as if nothing had happened. The few guests who noticed assumed that Morrison had simply had too much to drink. Sarah walked calmly out of the house and down the path toward the parking area, her high heels clicking on the stone walkway. Behind her, she could hear the sirens getting closer, and she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The colonel was dead, his organization was destroyed, and a dozen young women would soon be free. It wasn't enough to end human trafficking or even to make a significant dent in the global trade. The colonel had been right about that, but it was something, and sometimes something was all you could achieve in a single night. As Sarah reached a rental car and drove away from the Montecito estate, she thought about what came next. There would be other monsters to hunt, other operations to shut down, other girls to save. The work would never truly be finished, but that was okay. She had found her purpose in the darkness, and she was prepared to keep fighting for as long as necessary. The Black Viper had claimed another victory, but Sarah Martinez was already planning the next one. The war against human trafficking was far from over, but tonight, at least, the good guys had won. 6 months after the Montecito operation, Sarah Martinez stood in the arrivals terminal of Denver International Airport, watching travelers reunite with their families and begin new journeys. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking like any other woman in her mid-20s waiting for a friend's flight. The transformation from the elegant Elena Vasquez to this ordinary appearance was complete, another layer in the complex identity that had become her life. But today was different. Today, Sarah wasn't hunting monsters or planning operations. She was waiting for someone who represented everything she had been fighting to protect. Maria Santos, a 16-year-old girl who had been rescued from one of the colonel's satellite operations, and who bore the same last name that Sarah had once carried. The connection wasn't biological. Santos was a common name in the Hispanic community. But When Sarah had learned about Maria's case during the debriefing sessions that followed the Montecito raid, something had stirred in her that she hadn't felt in years. The desire to build something instead of just tearing things down. Maria emerged from the security checkpoint, looking small and lost, clutching a worn backpack that contained everything she owned. Her dark eyes darted around the crowded terminal with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that danger could come from anywhere at any time. Sarah recognized the look. She had seen it in mirrors for years after her own escape. Maria? Sarah approached slowly, keeping her hands visible and her voice gentle. I'm Sara Martinez. We spoke on the phone. The girl's eyes searched Sarah's face, looking for deception or hidden threats. You're the one who helped me get out? I'm the one who helped coordinate your rescue, Sarah replied carefully. The truth was more complicated than that, but Maria didn't need to know about the Black Viper or the violent world that Sarah inhabited. I wanted to make sure you were settling in okay. Over the past 6 months, Sarah had used her contacts and resources to arrange for Maria's placement with a foster family in Colorado, far from the networks and organizations that might try to reclaim her. The Hartmans were good people who specialized in helping trafficking survivors rebuild their lives, and Maria had been making remarkable progress under their care. But today's meeting wasn't about checking on Maria's welfare. It was about something Sarah had been considering for months. The possibility that her war against human trafficking didn't have to be fought alone. They found a quiet coffee shop in the airport, and Sarah ordered drinks while Maria sat with her back to the wall, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd. It was a positioning that Sarah understood all too well. Even years after her escape, she still felt more comfortable when she could see all the exits. How are you doing with the Hartmans? Sarah asked once they were settled. Maria's face brightened slightly. They're nice. Mrs. Hartman makes really good breakfast, and Mr. Hartman has been teaching me to drive. She paused, then added more quietly, they don't ask too many questions about before. That's good. You don't owe anyone your story until you're ready to tell it. They talked for a while about ordinary things, school, friends, plans for the future. Maria was smart and resilient, with dreams of becoming a teacher or maybe a social worker. She wanted to help other kids, she said, kids who had been through what she had experienced. That was when Sarah began to outline the proposition that had brought her to Denver. What if I told you there was a way to help those kids that went beyond traditional social work? Sarah asked carefully, something more direct. Maria's eyes sharpened, and Sarah saw intelligence there that reminded her painfully of her own younger self. What do you mean? Sarah chose her words carefully. Maria was still a minor, still recovering from trauma, and the last thing Sarah wanted was to exploit her desire to help others. But the girl had something that couldn't be taught, the motivation that came from personal experience. There are people working to stop trafficking operations, to rescue girls like you before they disappear completely. It's dangerous work, and it requires people who understand what the victims have gone through. Sarah paused, studying Maria's reaction. I think you might be someone who could do that kind of work someday, if you wanted to. Maria was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Sarah was suggesting. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and mature beyond her years. You're talking about what happened at that party in Arizona, aren't you? The one where all those people got arrested and that crime boss got killed. Sarah felt a chill of surprise. The official reports had mentioned an anonymous tip that led to the raid, but they hadn't connected it to the Black Viper. How do you know about that? People talk, Maria said simply, especially people who've been where I've been. There's stories about someone who hunts the hunters, someone they call the Black Viper. She leaned forward slightly. Is that you? Sarah met the girl's gaze steadily, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. Yes. Maria nodded as if she had expected that answer. I thought so. The way you move, the way you watch everything. You're always ready for a fight. She paused. Are you asking me to join you? Not yet, Sarah said quickly. You're too young, and you're still healing. But maybe someday, when you're older and if you still want to help, we could work together. I've been thinking about building something bigger than just me. A network of people who survived this, and want to make sure others don't have to. The idea had been growing in Sarah's mind for months. The Black Viper was effective, but limited. She could only be in one place at a time, could only save so many people. But what if there were others like her? Survivors who had transformed their pain into purpose, who could work together to dismantle trafficking networks from the inside out. What would that look like? Maria asked. Sarah outlined the concept she had been developing. Safe houses for rescued victims, training programs for those who wanted to become active agents, intelligence networks that could identify and track trafficking operations before they could establish themselves. It would be part witness protection, part special forces unit, part support group. "We call it the underground," Sarah said. "A place where survivors could choose their own level of involvement. Some might just need safety and support to rebuild their lives. Others might want to help with intelligence gathering or victim services. And a few might want to become hunters themselves." Maria's eyes lit up with something that Sarah recognized as hope mixed with determination. "When could we start?" Sarah smiled, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that her mission might outlive her, that the work could continue even if something happened to the Black Viper. "We already have," she said. "Your rescue, your placement with the Hartmans, this conversation, it's all part of building something new. But first, you need to finish growing up. Graduate high school, maybe go to college, learn skills that will make you more effective when the time comes." They spent the next hour discussing practicalities. Sarah would maintain contact with Maria, providing guidance and resources as needed. When Maria turned 18, and if she still wanted to be involved, they would begin more formal training. In the meantime, Sarah would begin identifying and recruiting other survivors who might be interested in joining the network. As they prepared to part ways, Maria asked the question that Sarah had been dreading. "What about you? What happens to the Black Viper while we're building this underground?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She had been the Black Viper for so long that she sometimes forgot there had ever been anyone else. The identity had consumed her, shaped her, defined her entire existence for years. The idea of stepping back from that role, even partially, felt like losing a part of herself. But it also felt like gaining something more important, the possibility of a legacy that extended beyond her own actions. "The Black Viper will keep hunting," she said finally. "But maybe she won't have to hunt alone much longer." As Sarah watched Maria disappear into the crowd, heading back to her flight and her new life with the Hartmans, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her own escape: genuine hope for the future. For years, she had fought a war that seemed unwinnable, taking down individual operations while knowing that others would spring up to replace them. But now she could see a different path forward. Instead of just attacking the problem from the outside, the underground would work to change it from within. Survivors would become protectors, victims would become hunters, and the very people the traffickers preyed upon would become their greatest threat. The network would take years to build, and not everyone would want to participate. Many survivors just wanted to heal and move on with their lives, and Sarah respected that choice completely. But for those who felt called to fight back, the underground would provide training, resources, and, most importantly, the knowledge that they weren't fighting alone. 3 weeks after her meeting with Maria, Sarah stood in an abandoned warehouse in Detroit. But this time she wasn't there to conduct a raid. She was there to meet with Dr. Jennifer Park, a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma recovery and who had been working with trafficking survivors for over a decade. Dr. Park was in her 40s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that put people at ease even in difficult circumstances. She had reached out to Sarah after hearing about the underground concept through mutual contacts in the victim services community. "I have to admit, I was skeptical at first," Dr. Park said as they walked through the empty space. "The idea of training trauma survivors to become active agents sounds like it could be re-traumatizing." "It could be," Sarah agreed. "That's why we need people like you involved, to make sure we're helping people heal, not just weaponizing their pain." Dr. Park nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about your proposal, and I think there's merit to it. But We need strict psychological evaluations, ongoing therapy requirements, and clear protocols for when someone needs to step back from active duty. Sarah was grateful for the doctor's practical approach. She had been worried that mental health professionals would dismiss the underground as dangerous or misguided. Dr. Park's willingness to engage with the concept suggested that it might actually be viable. They spent the next hour discussing the psychological framework that would support the underground. Training programs would include extensive therapy and healing work before any tactical instruction. Members would undergo regular psychological evaluations and would be required to maintain their mental health as a condition of participation. Most importantly, everyone would have the right to change their mind at any time, to step back from active work, and focus on their own recovery without judgment or pressure. There's something else, Dr. Park said as they concluded their meeting. I've been working with a young woman named Rachel, a trafficking survivor who was rescued about 8 months ago. She's been asking about ways to help other victims, and I think she might be interested in what you're building. Sarah felt a familiar spark of possibility. Each new person who joined the underground would bring their own skills, perspectives, and connections. The network would grow organically, building strength through shared purpose and mutual support. 2 hours later, Sarah met Rachel at a small cafe in downtown Detroit. She was 19 years old, with red hair and freckles that made her look younger than her age. But there was something in her green eyes that Sarah recognized, the hardness that came from surviving something that should have killed you. Dr. Park told me you're starting some kind of organization, Rachel said without preamble. Something for people like us. Something by people like us, Sarah corrected. The underground isn't about being saved. It's about saving others. Rachel leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. What would you need from someone like me? Sarah studied the young woman, seeing potential that reminded her of her younger self. What are you good at? Computers, Rachel said immediately. Before everything happened, I was studying computer science. I know my way around networks, databases, encryption. I've been thinking about how traffickers use technology and how we could turn it against them. Sarah felt a surge of excitement. She had been thinking about the technological aspects of building the underground, but her own skills were more focused on the physical side of operations. Someone like Rachel could be invaluable in developing the digital infrastructure they would need. Show me, Sarah said, pushing her laptop across the table. For the next 30 minutes, Rachel demonstrated her capabilities, hacking into various systems with an ease that was both impressive and slightly terrifying. She explained how trafficking networks use social media to identify targets, how they moved money through cryptocurrency and offshore accounts, and how law enforcement's technological limitations often allowed criminals to stay one step ahead. I've been mapping some of the networks that held me, Rachel said as she worked, tracking their communications, their financial transactions, their recruitment patterns. I know it's probably legal, but sometimes illegal is the only way to get justice, Sarah finished. Rachel looked up from the laptop, and Sarah saw her own philosophy reflected in the young woman's eyes. Exactly. By the time they parted ways, Rachel had agreed to become the underground's first official recruit. She would spend the next few months working with Dr. Park on her psychological healing while also developing the technological framework that would support the organization's operations. As Sarah drove back to her hotel that evening, she thought about how much had changed in such a short time. 6 months ago, she had been a lone wolf, the Black Viper, hunting in isolation and carrying the weight of an impossible mission alone. Now she was building something that could outlast her, something that could continue the fight even if she wasn't there to lead it. The underground was becoming real, one person at a time. Maria would provide ground-level insights and eventually field operations. Dr. Park would ensure psychological wellness and proper training protocols. Rachel would handle technology and digital operations. And there would be others, safe house operators, intelligence analysts, support staff, and eventually a new generation of hunters who could carry on the work. Sarah pulled out her phone and composed a text message to Maria. The underground is growing. Are you still in? The response came back within minutes. Always. When do we start training? Sarah smiled as she put the phone away. The Black Viper would always be a part of who she was, but she was beginning to see that there was room for Sarah Martinez to exist as well. Room for someone who built things instead of just tearing them down, who created hope instead of just delivering justice. The war against human trafficking was far from over, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she might actually win it. Not through the actions of one person, but through the combined efforts of a community of survivors who had chosen to transform their pain into purpose. The Underground was more than just an organization. It was a promise that no one would have to fight alone, that survivors could become protectors, and that the darkness that had once consumed them could be turned into a light that would guide others to safety. Sarah Martinez, the woman who had once been Isabella Santos and who would always be the Black Viper, was finally coming home.